Welcome back to the Shine Within podcast. And Niki Saks is an accomplished entrepreneur, wellness coach, and writer with international qualifications in nutrition, fitness, and life skills. Her diverse career, spanning over 40 years, includes significant experience in the advertising industry and a commitment to personal development through communication. An avid traveler, Niki has engaged with a wide array of individuals, from presidents to celebrities, to inspiring everyday people. As an author, she advocates open discussions about pain and mental well-being, drawing from her own experiences to empower others. A mental health activist, Niki was born in South Africa and splits her time between Cape Town and Sydney, Australia. Wow, thank you so much for joining my show today. What an honor to have you, Niki.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. Now, for our listeners who don't really know about personality disorder, can you please share with the audience how it was like living with it and how it actually has impacted your daily life?
Well, thank you for asking. So I, about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, was diagnosed with something called borderline personality disorder. About 1.6% of the population know about that, or sorry, I have suffered from it, but most people don't understand what borderline personality disorder was. And when I found out about it, I looked like everybody does on Dr. Google, and I was horrified at what they said that I was, the type of person that I was. So basically, discovering it was rather scary. But at the same time, what it did for me is it made me realize why my life seemed to be a whole bunch of psychological things that just happened all strung together, and why I couldn't really get a grasp on anything specific. What I'm referring to is with borderline, you have a very like a wavering sense of yourself. So my self-worth was in question all the time. I didn't know where I fitted in. I found relationships incredibly difficult to maintain, both friendships and romantic relationships. Very highly emotive, so triggered quite easily by the smallest things. The main thing about borderline or BPD is it's a sense, there's a massive fear of abandonment. So anything that could trigger that fear makes the person respond to the world in a way that isn't rational. So highly impulsive. So how it affected me is literally in everything that I did for most of my life.
Yeah, I remember I was just sharing with you before I hit record that for many, many years I was an alcoholic. And I remember when I would drink, I would get very irrational and go off of impulse and start doing things that normally I would not do today. So for example, I remember one time when I was married, this was my first marriage. I remember I was in my delusional mind. Um, I thought he was like seeing somebody, which wasn't true. It was in my head. So then I was getting all angry and frustrated. And I remember I was grabbing his clothes and throwing them out on our patio, like, get out, da da da. And he wasn't even home yet, you know? So
The story that you make up in your head.
yeah, exactly. So it was a story that I made up in my head. And I was just acting on it. And I remember that's the time that he says, no more, Gina, I'm taking our son and we're staying at my mom's house because your behavior is very irrational. So I've experienced those different impulses. Now, do you see it very common with women versus men, or is it about the same?
I think that, firstly, there's borderline traits and there's borderline personality disorder. It's the same as narcissism. There's people that can have narcissistic traits, and there are those that are just completely overt that have narcissistic personality disorder. So when I mention a lot of the traits about borderline, people go, but hang on a second, that sounds a bit like me, or I've done that, or that's, so there's a lot of traits that a lot of people have, but they're not, it's a clinical diagnosis. It's not something that we can just say, oh, well, I feel borderline. So that's being said. I think that the reason women respond the way they do in situations like you're talking about, firstly, when you drink, as you know, all sense of self and everything just kind of goes out the window. And I know this because, as I shared with you as well, I've had a sobriety journey. And I think that there's so much pressure to be on relationships in order to feel whole. So there's so much of us that feel, unless we're in a relationship, or unless we're seen in a certain way, or unless we're living a certain life, that that we can't, there's something wrong with us. And I think that drives enormous amounts of anxiety. And it also, certainly, when you're not thinking rationally, one goes to a default place of, I'm not good enough. If my boyfriend leaves me, there's something wrong with me. And that just becomes a narrative that goes on and on in one's head, that, and it stems right back to one's insecurity of self and of the situation. If you do drink, then, you do feel out of control and out of sync. So it would explain a behavior like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, and you've been vocal about breaking the stigma around or surrounding mental health, I should say. What are some common misconceptions about BPD that you would like to address?
Well, I think the first common myth about any mental illness is, in my book, which I've recently launched, called Hiding in the Open, Living Sensitively. In my book, I state there that, people look at others that have mental illness, and they look at them as being scary, like they're going to harm them or harm themselves or something like that. So there's a stigma around mental illness. As far as borderline goes, the stigma is just cray cray. They think like you're just completely crazy. Some psychologists believe years ago, not too long ago, actually, in like the 70s, that borderline people that suffered were not able to treat because it's so difficult to define their disorder, that they were untreatable. But the common stigmas around borderline are those with mental illness, I personally think people's fear of or misunderstanding that causes stigma is based on their fear. Because a lot of people, in my opinion, are so worried that they can be classified, because the degrees of separation of somebody that or somebody that you care about, or whatever, having a mental disorder is very likely. So I think people tend to judge and stigmatize possibly because of their own fear of falling into a category with mental illness. So there are massive stigmas around that. I'm actively trying to demystify, if I can, and have the conversations that are difficult to have.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people are afraid to speak about it, like, hey, do I have something going on? Because we're conditioned, and going back to what you were saying, like how we don't really know who we truly are. And I think a lot of it is because of our conditioning from like schools, people who we hang out with, even our government. So it's challenging because we want to discover who we are, but yet I mean, for personally speaking, I was very afraid, and my nervousness, my anxiety started from when I was maybe 8 years old, and that was from childhood trauma. And it started in my stomach, and I was diagnosed having irritable bowel syndrome, when really it was just nerves, because I was fearful. And then it wound up going up into my chest. And then I started drinking because I thought that was going to help anxiety, but it made it way much worse. So I'm interested in your book, though. So the journey in hiding in the open, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, and you discussed like the challenges of living with borderline personality disorder. Can you share like a pivotal moment from your book that significantly impacted your own journey?
Yeah, I'd like to just highlight here that, and something that you brought up that is really
Yeah.
pertinent now, and that is, the trauma. So yes, society and social media feeds into our sense of self-worth in a big way. So as we all know, I try and I stay off social media as much as possible, which doesn't really help me with my business. I need to be on it, but it doesn't make one feel a lot better about themselves a lot of the time. But one of the things that really does affect and create mental illness is the families of origin. So you speak about childhood trauma, and that really, between 0 and about 10 years of age, are your formative years. That's when a lot of the conditioning that you have, the sense of self, the awareness of things, the hypervigilance to, if you grew up in a home that was traumatic, the likelihood of you suffering from some mental illness, such as anxiety or a disorder, is pretty high. So I grew up in a highly dysfunctional home. And I've realized, the more people, interestingly, the more people I speak to, the more I realized I'm not alone. And I never thought I was, but it's interesting that my book has started various conversations. My father was abusive. My mom got the brunt of most of it, but it had such a profound impact on me witnessing the abuse, that I started to become like, I would switch off in such a way emotionally, that I would just disappear. And I would often question, I could give you examples of what happened and that are written in my book, but I would often question what the reason for living was. I would kind of say, well, if this is life, I don't know that I want it. And that's another thing about borderline is there's a very high suicide rate with borderlines, because they kind of, it's a weird dichotomy. They don't want to die, but they don't want to live either a lot of the time. And it's just trying to escape the emotional pain that is so difficult. And again, it's not just with borderline. I think that a lot of people that suffer from anxiety and mental illness have those feelings at some point, that they just don't know how to get through, how to manage the situation or manage a moment. And yeah, I mentioned kind of recovery in my book.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how does one actually diagnose someone and say, "Hey, okay, you are clinically diagnosed as having borderline personality disorder"?
Well, and as I said, it does need to be a clinical diagnosis. So between my psychologist and psychiatrist. So to start off, I was diagnosed many years ago with having bipolar.
Mm.
But I couldn't understand, bipolar 1 is having massive highs and massive lows. I just kind of had a lot more lows and very few highs. So I went to seek help, and between my doctor, my psychiatrist and psychologist, they diagnosed it. And they said that there is a way that you can arrest the traits. So it basically means there's things you can do in order to live a life worth living, but it takes work. And it's possible, but you can't ever not be a borderline. Or if you have anxiety, the likelihood of you not having anxiety is pretty low. You just need to learn how to manage it.
Yes, and what
So
are oh, go ahead.
no, Karen.
Oh, I was to say, yeah, what are some of the things that we can do to manage our anxiety?
There's a lot of methods, but I go back to there's a practice called DBT, dialectal behavioral therapy. And it's like an extension of CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mhm.
It's a mindfulness-based practice. So it's very much about living in the moment, validating your experience, how you're feeling. It's about emotional regulation, how to communicate in relationships, but it's all on a very mindful practice. And going to your breath, it's all the mindfulness kind of practices that one would do. The most important thing, I think, is validating one's experience. So, for instance, if you're feeling a certain way, to not say, what is wrong with me? Why am I feeling this way? But to rather say, I'm feeling this way. I understand it. I might be acting a little irrationally, but I'm feeling this way because that triggered me. So to have the conversation with yourself, that immediately kind of calms you down. Then to do some instant kind of breath work that will make you just start breathing again. And with anxiety, people forget to breathe.
Mhm.
And that's why then you think, hang on, I'm not breathing. And then you feel as if it goes like you get a golf ball in your throat and you can't, So it's going back to your breath. And sometimes it's difficult when you're sitting at a dinner table, something triggers you and you just sit there going, doing yoga breaths. But there's very simple techniques that you can do, which I'm happy to explain, that you can do in the moment. There's something, and I call it box breathing because it's easy to remember. So as if you are drawing a box with your breath. So you breathe in deep for 4 counts, you hold it for 4 counts, you breathe out for 4 counts, and then you just remain still for 4 counts. If you can do a couple of those, it's amazing how it just settles you into the moment before you can react. So the ideal is to get a handle on how you're feeling, how to respond to it is through breath, and then to act as opposed to reacting to what the situation is. So once you control yourself, a lot of people find that to remove themselves from the situation, perhaps, and go and splash water on their face, to eat a very strong mint. It's really just a situational thing where you have to, for a moment, just stop how you're feeling. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. It reminded me of one time I was in an outpatient program for anxiety. Really, it was for because I was drinking, but I was keeping that a secret. I didn't want to admit that I was an alcoholic at that time. But I remember the counselor, teacher, mentor, I'm not sure what she was. She was
Yeah.
there. Someone was experiencing anxiety at that time. And then I guess because we're doing like I guess she was asking her a question and then she got like nervous and scared and she's like, I'm so sorry, I'm experiencing anxiety. I can't really talk right now. And then the lady started asking her different questions about different things in her life, and then she started responding to them. And then the lady said, the teacher asked the woman, now, how do you feel now? She's like, oh yeah, I feel much better because she diverted her mind and thinking to whatever the conversation
Autopilot.
was. Yeah, exactly. Instead of thinking about her anxiety. Because really
Yeah.
anxiety for me personally is like fear of the unknown. Like I would get, like, for me, for example, I would be so scared that I was going to pass out from like breathing too fast or hyperventilating, that I was going to black out. Especially when I was driving, I was fearful. Like I would just tense up all of a sudden, and because there's some crazy drivers over here. Anyway, so I would like tense up and then start breathing, and then I'd be so scared, like, oh my goodness, am I going to pass out? Am I going to, like, all these questions? What if? What if? What if? But it's like, no, no, no. And like you said, if I would have done that box technique of breathing, I think that just would have helped me just be in the present moment instead of just overthinking everything.
I think that makes sense. And what you're saying is very, very real to a lot of people. In a driving situation, I mean, one and that's the thing, when you're living in the future, when you get into your car and you think, oh my goodness, what can happen to me? You can get anxious. If you live in the present, you can manage the present. So if you get in your car and you say, I'm driving the speed limit, I'm doing everything right, nothing's going to happen to me in this moment. You live in this moment, in this moment. If you're thinking ahead, you get anxious. If we think about the future and what may happen, we get anxious. So it really is, and people talk about it all the time about staying present. It really is saying, I'm okay in this moment. I'm okay in this moment. Right now, I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm okay. And just, in your mind, having that conversation with yourself, because, I always say that if you look in the past, you get depressed. And if you look in the future, you get anxious. So all you have is the present to deal with.
Yes, the present moment. I actually have a tattoo. It says "Be here now." It was like a reminder of like be here now. Like this is all we have is right now. That's all we have right now. So
Well,
yeah.
I have a tattoo as well, and it says "Live the dash."
Ah,
Yeah, the
love
dash
that.
is on your tombstone when you die. You have the date you're born and the date you die, and there's a dash in between those two dates.
I was wondering, like, thinking about what is dash?
Yeah,
Oh, maybe
that's the dash. Live your
it's
dash.
oh.
Live between those two dates. You got to live.
Oh, but that makes total sense. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
great. Now,
yeah.
you mentioned reaching a point in life where you recognize your power to change your path. Now, can you elaborate on that turning point and how that actually embraced your challenges?
Absolutely. I was in another dead end relationship, thinking that I just couldn't do it anymore. And I was super depressed and nothing was helping. And somebody suggested that I go and see a counselor that specialized, as I said, in this technique called dialectical behavioral therapy. And I was at rock bottom. I've experienced rock bottoms before, but this was just like I didn't know what to do. I had nothing left in the tank. So I went to go and see this guy, and we spoke for a bit. And for the first time, he actually validated my experience, what I was going through, how I was reacting, how I was responding. And I said to him, what is wrong with me? So he said, well, this is how you're feeling. You've got certain issues that need to be managed in a special way. So I embarked on a journey with him where I did this training for a year. And it was actually devised, the DBT skills, dialectical behavioral therapy, is so it's a way of seeing two opposites as opposed to seeing just black and white. When we tend to get in a situation where we get anxious or where we see black or white, we think everything's bad or everything's good. So this training also teaches you to look at everything on a spectrum, to stand back and get perspective. So I dived into this. I thought, what have I got to lose? And every single day for a year, I did this. And what happened at the end of it? And he promised me that. He said, I promise at the end, once you finish this, you will know that you will live a life that is worth living. And that is so true. It's what happened for me. It was as if suddenly there was light. Suddenly I felt lighter. But part of that has also been me putting a manifesto together, which I've put in my book. There are certain things that I need to be damn sure I'm going to do every single day to make sure that I'm okay. And that's where recovery comes in too. That's what you need to do each day, one day at a time, to be able to get through the day. And I know that I need certain things. I know that I need to get 7 to 8 hours of sleep a day. I know that I need to do exercise. I know there's a certain thing that I have to do. So that is how it affected me. My life got to a point where as I said to you, I didn't want to live, but I didn't want to die. And I just needed a change. And it seemed doable. It seemed that I could manage it just one day at a time, going through the process, and learning more about myself, which was at the time, which was fantastic help.
Yeah, it is true. One day at a time, that's all we have is the present moment, and we just go day by day, day by day. And your
It's just
story, yeah,
incrementally, it just seems a lot easier to do, you know?
absolutely. And so your
Yeah.
story is incredibly inspiring. What is the key message you hope readers will take away from your book? And just, I should say, and get that aha moment.
Well, there's a lot, but I think the key thing for me is, um, I'm hoping that through the message of my book, I can help people see that they're not alone, that they should lean into the difficult conversations, start talking to people about mental illness, start being more vulnerable, but also that, there's the power to change the way that you think. There is a power for you yourself to take responsibility and change the way that your brain works. And I talk about that in my book, that you can, over a period of time, you can change the way that you do things. And it really is for me about self-empowerment with mental illness. So instead of, a lot of people can't access help, can't afford it, whatever, there's a way that you can actually change the way that you are thinking and live a life of living.
Oh, I love that. Yes. And where can people find your book?
My book is on Amazon and it's on Kindle. Haven't yet done an Audible book, but that's in the pipeline. So it is available, and it's hiding in the open, and it's living sensitively. So that's a subtitle.
That's awesome. And I'll have all that in the show notes as well. But has actually sharing your story publicly, through your book and maybe perhaps even speaking engagements, has that impacted your own healing process?
Definitely has, like anything. And that's, I talk about as the book, it's called neuroplasticity in your brain. And what happens is, if you do something over a period like of time, things change. So this is like positive affirmations for me all the time, and talking about it. And it's interesting when you start having conversations with people, how they lean in as well. So if you start breaking stigmas and start, people may look at me or you and think your life's perfect. And then when they start, when you're honest with them and you open up a little bit, then they think, hang on a second, if I thought her life was perfect, my life, is okay. So it's, yeah, it's been very good for me, this process. It's been great.
Yeah,
And I've
definitely.
been honored to have been able to do it.
Yeah, definitely therapeutic. Just writing your story and having it there. Because I'm trying to write a book myself. I haven't
Okay.
touched it in like in 3 months, but I noticed as I was writing it, I feel better. Like I feel like, oh, breath of
Well,
fresh air.
it's like journaling, isn't it? It's like journaling when you get there's something that actually happens when you're writing with a pen and it's coming out of you. And they say that's why sometimes just journaling, just writing whatever comes to your mind. As far as the book, it also kind of tends to happen when it happens. I'm very blessed to have been able to put it together, and I dedicate it to my children, so that they can know what their crazy mom was going through. Why she was doing her best to possibly do her best. But I always say that we do the best with the tools that we have. So but it'll happen. It was slow in the beginning, and then it just flowed, and it'll flow.
Yes, and that's what I was hoping that my son, he's 15 and I have two little ones as well. But with my older son, I do want him to read my story. And, I do my podcast and I have TikTok and he actually added me on TikTok. Like, I didn't know he had a TikTok account. And so I hope he actually like looks at some of the sound bites that I have of speaking with like guests and talking about like mental health and things that we all go through as human beings, because we've all gone through it.
We're
We've
all
gone through it.
we're all spiritual people having a human experience, right?
Totally, yes.
Yeah.
And then for those who might be actually struggling with BPD and other mental illnesses, just like depression, anxiety, what advice would you actually offer them based on your experiences and journey?
I would suggest that they are gentle with themselves and understand that most of us are affected in some way, and that they should find ways of managing it to the best of their ability. And if it's reading as much as they can about recovery, reading about, as I said, DBT skills, CBT, whatever, but it's becoming empowered with knowledge, and not being afraid to talk to people and being, vulnerable. One has to be mindful of who they're vulnerable with, but you'll be surprised. If I always say, if you lean in, how people lean in with you. So
Right.
start having conversations. I think that's important.
Yes, I agree. I agree. Now, where can our listeners go ahead and either follow? I know you said you weren't too much on social media, but in case they want to see you on social media or perhaps your website.
Yeah, my website is Niki Saks, NIKISAKS, like Saks Fifth Avenue, Niki Saks .com. So it's nikisaks.com. They can email me from the website directly. My email address is nikisaks.author@gmail.com. And I'm happy to talk to people that, a lot of people have reached out to me about family members or somebody they think, or a partner that they think may have the symptoms of that, of BPD. So I'm obviously not a psychiatrist or psychologist. I'm a wellness mentor. I've studied coaching, and all I can do is share my experience. I can't give a diagnosis, but I'm very, very willing to have a conversation with anybody that needs to reach out.
That's wonderful, Nikki. Well, any last words or last thoughts?
I just, it's, I just say, don't give up until the miracles happen.
Yes, that's so beautiful. I love that. I'm going to write that down.
Okay. I think that, even when you're feeling really not great, the next day can be miraculous. So it's just to keep on keeping on.
Yeah, keep going. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Nikki. It's such a blessing to
Thank
have
you.
you on my show and just sharing all of your insights and expertise and helping those who needed to hear this message today. So thank you so much.
I really appreciate you having me on your show, Gina. Thank you. It's been lovely.
Thank you.